The very first day I arrived in New York, a boy I liked took me to a gay restaurant. And I thought, oh, I know about gay bars and I know about cruising places, but the idea that gay people would want to eat together seems so strange.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Edmund White, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Villa Aurora to the biographical exchange between Edmund White and Jörn Jacob Rohwer. In 1995, Villa Aurora, the former home of Jewish German writer Leon Feuchtner and his wife Martha, became an artist residency and returned to being a place for international cultural encounters. Jörn Jacob Rohwer, writer and journalist, has been fellow at Villa Aurora in 2005. In his latest book, The Seismography of Questioning, Jörn Jacob Rohwer talked to internationally renowned personalities like Susan Sontag, Robert Wilson, David Hockney, and Edmund White. Edmund White's travel to Europe is a lucky coincidence for the conversation that is going to happen tonight, since the book, The Seismography of Questioning, has been published in 2014. I'd like to thank all partners who made this event possible, Alexander Hamann and Michael Taubenheim from Bruno Gmünder Verlag, Andrik Stettenhofer from Salis Verlag, and Birgit Bosold from the Queer Museum in Berlin. Thank you so much for this wonderful cooperation. I also want to welcome Bernd Feuchtner, moderator of tonight's talk. He taught at different universities. He is a journalist, a publicist, and opera director, and he will introduce the participants of tonight's conversation.
Edmund wrote 4 books about autobiographical novels and later other novels about biography. So it looks like you are a little bit obsessed with your own biography. Was it a gift to have such a special biography?
Well, when I wrote A Boy's Own Story, I didn't think of it as the first volume of a trilogy. And I certainly thought of myself as a very strange person when I started writing. Then later I realized that I was representative of many gay men of my generation. I mean, that my experience was like other people's. And so then I wrote The Beautiful Room is Empty, which ends with the Stonewall riot. And then I wrote The Farewell Symphony, which was about before and after AIDS. And so that was that. But those were novels. And in a novel, you have a different contract with the reader. You don't promise to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. You promise to make it entertaining and interesting. But then I wrote these other books like City Boy about New York in the 1960s and 70s, and Inside a Pearl, which was about Paris in the 80s and 90s, and then I wrote My Lives, because I always find it so boring when people start with their childhood. And so I thought, I won't organize my book that way, but rather by topics. So like my mother, my father, my shrinks, my blondes, and so on.
What do you think is the interest of these novels today? Is it more historic, or is there still some reality in America?
Well, I think that because of AIDS and the long battle against it, there became a lot of people who were gay people who were sex phobic, and I was oftentimes attacked by these people for liking sex too much and pleasure too much. But I think now things are changing and people are coming back to I mean, of course things are different because there's now gay marriage and gay adoption and so on, but I think that many people are returning to a life of pleasure.
Normal people are collecting books or paintings. You are collecting biographies. What made you hunting for the life of others?
Well, is it really a hunting? I hope it is an exploring. I guess it's been said that it's an exploration of personalities. And what made me start that, I think, was my very self, my life. You know, if you want to explore, you can only explore yourself and find out about yourself, or vice versa, find out about others when you know about your very self. So I think this is how it started. You know, I've always been a person very reflective and inquiring about myself, and I've always been inquiring about others. And the personality of others is always a fascinating subject, whether they're well-known or famous or not famous. You know, it's like in friendship, you really want to get to know the other person, and if you don't, then how could you be friends, I'd say. And in some ways, the people I have met have also been considered friends, like Edmund. You know, many interviews, and I consider my work not as interviews but as conversations, but interviews can easily be exploitative. We talked about this yesterday, and thankfully we agreed that mine are not, because I think my work is at the same time giving. I'm also trying to give something to the other insofar as I'm mirroring the other person through my questions and my commentaries, and the other one sometimes can learn something about him or herself. At least that is a goal. I don't think that I always reach it, but it has happened that people have afterwards said, thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this, because I've learned something. So this is part of what I do and why I do it.
I read your book. It has 800 pages and I think 48 talks,
Yes,
biographical talks. Mm-hmm. And they are not always friendly. You are sometimes questioning people to find the hidden point in their biography. There must be a deeper interest.
Well, you know, when it comes to such issues, so to speak, then it is because I know or sense that people are hiding something compulsory, and there's always a difference between the public image and the private image, and you want to see what delicate balance that is, and you can only see behind that if you inquire about the difficulties, the ugly sides of life, or ugly aspects of a period of a life of a person, and that can be very unpleasant sometimes, and some people really like to talk about that. That's the other side. You know, they want to talk about everything, but that is not of interest for me. Of interest for me are those who are rather secretive, and
For instance, you found out that Arthur Miller had a son that he never acknowledged, and this is the man who wrote a play called All My Sons, and who always pretended he was a model of openness, but in fact he had this secret son. That I found very interesting.
Thank you, Edmund. That's precisely the point. But at the time when I met Arthur Miller in 2000, it was not publicly known that he had the son Daniel, who suffering from a Down syndrome, so to speak, and that Miller and his wife had hid Daniel. Had I known that, had it been knowledgeable, then I would have approached him in a different way. But that is particularly interesting, for a man who has, for the most time of his life as a writer, written about father-son relationship. And how, if that is being discussed in the book, how could he ever hide his own son? You know? Let's leave it as a question here.
He could. Of course, I think your interview partners want to use you as well and to build their public image because they, especially Leni Riefenstahl, who was interviewed by you, it was a very funny interview because nothing of what she really said was in the end in the interview almost.
Well, nothing is a little overdone, I would say, you know. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been printed. But you know, all those points that were really crucial and you know very disputable have been cut out in the end.
I had some dealings with Leni Riefenstahl in the 60s because I was working for Time Life Books and we were doing a book on Africa, a great big picture book, and her pictures of the African wrestlers were the most beautiful. And we wanted to use them, but there were many older people at the time who were Jewish and who said never, never. And so I talked to her quite a bit, and she was very interesting in that she, at the end of the war, she had nothing really. And the Leica company gave her a camera and some film, and she hitchhiked her way to Africa. She was already pretty old. And then she, oh, well.
You consider that old when... Thank you.
Well, I was in my 20s, so that seemed kind of old. But,
all right.
But anyway, and then she took these brilliant pictures. But I mean, you could see, she took all these pictures of these African men and from below, looking up at them, and they looked like gods. And she was, in a way, up to her old fascist tricks, you know.
Sometimes after you had an interview with somebody and it has been printed, was there ever a point of regret?
With me or with the other
yes,
person?
That you would have done something or asked something differently if you had known certain things which you learned only later?
Well, I gave one example, which was Arthur Miller, and I usually tend to not, you know, this is like, talking about that is like calling people names, and I try to avoid that. It's sort of indiscreet, but without giving names, yes, there have been regrets, and in one case, a deep regret, because as you said before, there are people who also try to use, or have tried to use me for their own, you know, sake, or for their own popularity or fame. And that is a delicate balance, which one has to, you know, which one learns a lot about in the years, and one, you know, develops a sense for what people really want from you if someone is cooperating or giving or exploiting you. So yes, there have been regrets, but I've overcome them.
I think I felt the most exploited by the Times of London because a very nice, well-spoken, Oxford-accented boy called me up on the phone and said he was writing an article about intergenerational sex. And my lover is 25 years younger than I am. So he said, would you talk about it? And he was very serious and scholarly. And so I jabbered away. And then in those days, you didn't take the tunnel to London, but the airplane. And we were flying from Paris to London, and we opened the Times, and there was a headline saying, "The old goat is at it again." That was me. And I mean, it just taught me never to trust an English journalist. I mean, they're the most wicked.
How about the Germans?
The Germans are very nice and responsible, I think.
But you were very nice too. I remember it was a very hot summer day when we met in Paris, and all of a sudden, right in the middle of our conversation, the door swung open, and there stood a young man, you know, quite handsome, just dressed with a towel around his hips and asking, "Do you want any drinks?" It's Edmund's lover.
Jörn Jacob and I were talking about how so many journalists actually exploit their subject in the sense that, for instance, I interviewed Yves Saint Laurent, and I wanted to talk to him about his drug addiction and alcoholism. So I told him I was an alcoholic and stopped drinking in '83. But if you really think you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic, even if you're not drinking. Anyway, I talked about that very frankly with him, and then he talked very openly. But I included my confession in the article because I thought many times journalists will confess something of their own, but then they don't print that. They just do that to draw out the subject. And I think that's unfair. I think there are lots of unfair things that people do. Like I interviewed Catherine Deneuve, and she said that she has thousands and thousands of books, but she keeps them behind screens in her apartment. And this wicked English journalist said, "Not a book in sight. She's obviously an idiot."
Yeah, but I mean, the question is, does she actually read them? Because, you know, what do you do with books which you can't see? Because you have once told me how much you enjoyed the American libraries because books are all, you know, in open stalls and available.
And you
can
take them
actually
out, yeah.
browse through them, take them out, and, you know, what good are books behind, you know...
Yeah, you have to put them out and open them. Goethe tried to make a work of art out of his life, not only write books and plays and so on, but he wanted to make a work of art out of his own life. And I think that's a bit too much. Does everybody have to make a work of art of his life?
Well, I was a very good friend and disciple of Michel Foucault, who really believed that. I mean, toward the end of his life, he was asking himself, why, if there is no God, why do people bother to be good? And he thought that if you look back at the ancients, that many of them felt that they wanted to leave a kind of beautiful example of their lives, and the life as a work of art, as you say. And so he was trying to develop that idea as the basis for morality. I think it's interesting. I agree with him that writing a life story is very fascinating to do. I wrote the biography of Jean Genet, and I took 7 years to research that. And I think he was a fascinating example because he was brought up as a peasant and an orphan in the Morvan, which is sort of the heart of France. And he developed, and by the end of his life, he'd become a friend of the Black Panthers and the Palestinians, and he'd become one of the greatest French writers, and not the kind of writer that a prisoner, for instance, typically becomes very strong, but not very stylish. He became a very elegant writer, and we have to be grateful to him because he gave us the first drag queen in literature, and he really explored homosexuality in a fascinating way for his period.
But if you ask about, you know, making a piece of art of your own life, as many people do, or well-known people do, what I very much like about Edmund and always liked about him is that one has the feeling that you never really made that effort, because your books are very frank, especially your autobiographical books. They are very unpretentious. And I mean, they're just like you, the way you are. And I don't think that you actually try to, you know, make yourself...
Present an image.
Present an image. You are just what you are. As opposed, for instance, to Verushka, of who I have written a biography. You know, every detail of her life is, you know, part of an image. And precisely
Well, she was a fashion model, huh?
Yes, she was a fashion model, and she's a performance artist today. Whatever she does is very precisely calculated.
We are all reading biographies, and the question is, are we voyeurists? Do we take part in the secrets of the life of others, or what is it what drives us to read biographies?
Well, I think partly what you were saying earlier about somebody being a product of their period, of their socioeconomic status, of their education, but also the parental influences, and all these things are fascinating to see in a sort of laboratory pure example. But I think also you can learn a lot about the arts. And if you are yourself, let's say, a writer, and then I've written the lives of 3 writers, Proust, Rimbaud, and Genet, and you can sort of take courage from these people's example. I think a lot of people read biography to find some inspiration. I know my biography of Rimbaud was not as romantic as some people wanted it to be, because in a way I was a little skeptical of him, and didn't treat him as the child genius that everybody else does. So that was resented by some people. But I don't think a biographer's duty is to glorify the people of the past. I think Voltaire said, the only thing we owe the dead is the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. But to answer your question, I think it's not just inspiration that people seek, but it's also, you want to learn about yourself by reflecting or mirroring yourself and the other one. And that often means you can learn a lot about history when you study the life of the other person. And I think it's also about comparing yourself as a reader to the fate of the other one. Sometimes, if the one described has had kind of a brute or bad fate, then you feel relieved as a reader. And if the life has been extremely happy and yours hasn't, you may be a little depressed.
My colleague Susan Sontag calls certain, not Susan Sontag, Joyce Carol Oates calls certain kinds of biographies pathographies, because she thinks that so many biographers now want to show how somebody is neurotic, a pedophile, a coprophile, whatever, and that you take somebody famous, then you try to show that they're really disgusting.
Yeah, that was the case also with Verushka. The publisher said, oh yeah, we want to publish it. It's about sex, about beauty, it's about Hitler. And that, the life is about so much more than just these aspects.
Have you ever been looking for writing a biography of somebody yourself, or did you only have...
He did Verushka.
What do you mean, no?
The research like Edmund did about Genet, dedicating 7 years to another man's life and writing a book about this person. Have you ever been thinking about doing something like that?
Well, yes, I've been thinking about it, but I have not made a final choice and indulged in that ultimately. Also, I've been discussing in my work other people's biographies for more than 20 years now, and I prefer, I would say, I prefer the shorter works. That means if I do a conversation, it can last a couple of hours. It could also span over a few days. And that is, that should be sufficient, or that should be sufficient for me, because when you study another person for many years, you get away from your very self. This is what you precisely liked about when you studied the life of Genet.
Yeah.
But I think there was a lot of fascination and also identification with it. Whereas when I wrote the Verushka biography, there was of course no identification, because how could you identify with a person deeply, deeply traumatized? This is something that rather, you try to get over it with the other person. And so this is, a shorter version of a life as I try to compromise with my work is what I prefer to do, yes.
Well, you mentioned that I wrote all these autobiographical works, novels and memoirs, and I was so sick of saying I that I thought I would write a big fat book, The Life of Genet, and never once say the word I, and it was a great relief.
And you wrote it in Paris
Yeah.
as an American writer, and that gives a certain distance. And you lived for 16 years in Paris, didn't you?
Yeah.
But after all, New York is your city, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. And your city is Berlin, as you
Rather,
say in
yes.
the preface of your collection of talks.
It is, yes. I've spent lots of time in New York, and I can see many parallels, but this is where my language is, basically, and where I feel more at home as in New York, I would say.
Yeah, but both, you are not born in these cities. You come from northern Germany, you come from the Middle West.
Yeah.
What was it what drew you to these cities?
After you, Edmund.
Well, I wanted to be gay, and that's why I went to New York, I think, because there weren't, I guess there was San Francisco, but I don't know how to drive, so I didn't go to Los Angeles. But New York was perfect for me, and the very first day I arrived in New York, a boy I liked took me to a gay restaurant, and I thought, I know about gay bars, and I know about cruising places, but the idea that gay people would want to eat together seems so strange. But, I was absolutely fascinated by this very rich gay life. I arrived in 1962 in New York, and it was a very thriving period.
Yeah, for some of us, it's a surprise to hear about gay restaurants before Stonewall, because the police did not riot in these restaurants.
The police didn't close the restaurants, only the bars.
Why that?
Because the bars were mainly controlled by the mafia. Well, there were several reasons, but the main reason, I suppose, was that the mayor of New York wanted to clean up New York for the World's Fair in the 60s. And so as soon as a gay bar, we would all rush to a gay bar, and then within 3 days it would be closed. Or I remember going to a gay bar in the Times Square area called the Blue Bunny. And it was right next to the place where the Twist invented. And we would dance with each other, slow dance, and then there would be lights on the ceiling that they would turn on, and we would break apart because it meant that an undercover cop had just entered. You could always tell the cops by their shoes. But so gay restaurants, I think they didn't think that was a cruising spot. I'm sure they were wrong.
When I came to New York the first time, it was totally run down. That was in 1988, and I think that was still the Koch era.
What?
The Ed Koch era in the 1980s. He was the mayor, if you remember.
Oh,
him.
yeah, Ed Koch.
And that was a devastating image because the city was full of homeless everywhere on the streets, HIV people on the streets.
Yeah.
And I had a very different image of New York than I actually found. So it was sort of a shock for me, and it took a while until I decided to revisit And then by that time, I think Giuliani had taken over as a mayor, and the city had, ultimately or completely changed. I don't know if all to the good, but
No.
at least I wasn't that shocked anymore as before, and I was a little older by that time. And when I came to Berlin, I think I was much too shy to immediately, as you did, explore gay life. I had rather explored it through literature. Before I had come here, I had read a lot about books like those of Klaus Mann. He had written as a very young man, and I could identify with that very, illustrious life that he led that, of course, was not present any longer in Berlin. So I was rather trying to trace traces of the past in Berlin, which I did, and I was very fascinated to meet old people who had met, for instance, Anita Berber, who had been, a burlesque dancer or also a nude dancer in the 1920s in Berlin. I was very fascinated by the 20s and early 30s that had always been very mythological to not just to my generation, and I was looking for the remains of it. That is how I started Berlin. So a little more.
It was more the image of Berlin than Berlin itself.
The myth, yes, the myth. And it was the early 80s when I had first come to Berlin.
What was your impression of New York when you came back from your Paris time?
That it was very gentrified. I mean, that when I first lived in New York in the 60s and 70s, it was a very cheap city because it was very dangerous. And so artists could live there. And let's say a boy wanted to be an actor, he could be a waiter for 3 nights a week and earn enough money to support himself. Now it would be impossible in New York. And in this, so I think the fact that New York was dangerous was frightening, but it was all, I mean, we used to walk through the neighborhood I live in now, which is very gentrified and considered very respectable, Chelsea, was very dangerous in the 70s. And if gay guys would walk through it, they would wear a whistle around their neck and then blow it if they were attacked by a gang of straight kids. And then other gays, hopefully, would rush to their defense. But I mean, it's so crazy to think of that now because Chelsea is where very respectable people live now.
How do you remember the 60s in New York, Edmund? When you arrived, was it like a revelation to you?
Yes, I lived on McDougal Street in the heart of the old village, and the streets were so thronged with tourists and everybody that you couldn't even walk. And I felt like Superman because I would put on a coat and tie by day and work for Time magazine. And then at night I would rush home and put on my jeans with holes in them and run around changing my costume completely. And but I mean, I lived right across the street from Bob Dylan. I remember, I mean, I could drop all these names, but of that period, but it was very exciting.
Berlin. Have you ever been to Berlin in the early 80s? When it was the city, where Sade and David Bowie used to come to, and where the Jungle discotheque was kind of a meeting place for artists from all over the world. Had you been here? Do you remember the climate of
Yes.
early 80s Berlin?
Oh yeah,
I think you were a frequent visitor of the Paris bar by then.
yeah. And I knew Rosa von Braunheim and Charlotte von Malmesbury I met, and different people. I have a very vivid memory of that period in Berlin.
How was it like for you,
Berlin?
How was it like for you if you think back? The
Well,
divided Berlin.
Well, I mean, I think it was exciting both in terms of the arts. I mean, just like New York, exciting in terms of the arts and in terms of sex. I mean, I remember going to some abandoned factory building at midnight, and there were only candles in there, and everybody was having sex. And that was one image of Berlin. And then another was going to some of the concerts put on by Rosa von Braunheim.
Concerts?
Well, he presented Ingrid Carven.
Oh, right, yes,
Yeah.
now I know what you mean. Cabaret and chansonnière, cabaret
in a
singer.
proper theater. She was on stage, and he arranged the whole thing.
How do you perceive Berlin today, about 30 years later?
Well, it's like New York. It's much slicker. It seems very built up and very elegant now, and you know, I think the unification has been fascinating. I was here before the wall came down, and I wrote an article for Vogue magazine. And at that time, I interviewed Otto Schiele, who said to me, Germany is going to be reunited. And nobody in America thought that or ever heard that.
Before '89.
Yeah. I mean, he was the first person to predict it. And he said, it's more important to us that we're Germans than that we're communists or capitalists or whatever. And I mean, he had a very powerful vision of that. It was the first time I'd ever heard it. And I put it in my little article, but nobody read it.
Do you know that for a longer time there have been like 2 gay communities in Berlin, one in East Berlin and one
Yes,
in
I was
West
lucky
Berlin?
enough to, when I went to Brecht's Theater in the East, I went to a gay bar near the theater, which was very gemütlich. I mean, everybody was so sweet, and you know, and it was the way the gay bars were in America before everybody became so buff and beautiful. It used to be like the one white man who had a black wife. They would go to the gay bar. It was all the excluded people, and that's the way I felt in this East Berlin bar.
When we met in Paris way back then, we were also talking about so to speak, the evolution of gays from the 60s to the late 90s and, you know, to present time. And I remember you were very, very critical about something that you called a neo-fascist hedonism that would shape gay community, and that it was all about drugs and lifestyle and looks. Since we met, 15 years have passed. Do you see that a little more differentiated, or has that view changed?
Well, I think, I mean, at that point, I didn't know very many of these young people I was criticizing. Now I do know a lot of them, and I realize that under their looks, they're all different from each other, one from another. I mean, I teach at Princeton, and my students all come in, and they wear exactly the same clothes, and they have the same haircut. And then you begin to find out about their lives through their writing. And one is a Mormon whose father beat him every morning. Another is, you know, the son of a South American dictator. I mean, they're all just insanely different. So I think, you know, appearances can just deceive.
But what do you think what effect has AIDS had on gay life, basically? You know, it's been 30 years, more than 30 years than, you know, when it started. And
I think it's like a nightmare that people are waking up from now. I think with the PrEP, the new drugs, and everything, that people are less frightened by it. I mean, I've been positive since 1985, and I felt for the longest time as a positive person, I was stigmatized by the gay community. But now I think that people say, oh, well, so what? You know, they don't, I think people are more sophisticated about it now. And I think the fact that that I'm under treatment and I have 0 detectable virus, and therefore I'm not contagious. I think a lot of people get that now. And it's so irritating when you read the personal ads online, and they always say, I am negative, you be too. You know. In fact, there's a club of gay men in New York who are positive called You Be Too. You know, I mean, it's so irritating, and I think it's coming to an end.
But don't you think it's amazing that we are nowadays talking about gay marriage, whereas, you know, like 30 years ago, no one would probably ever have thought about it? And what role does AIDS play in that development and that change?
Well, I think that the original gay liberation people were radicals politically. They were socialists, or they were against the war in Vietnam, or they were for black liberation, or they were for women's liberation. And they were the only ones who were out and visible. And then because they were very experimental sexually, they all died off. And then they were replaced by much more bourgeois people and with different values. And I think that those gays, their highest ideal was to get married and to be just like everybody else.
Interesting point. Yesterday I talked to a friend of ours who is actually here tonight, and I asked him what is it for you? What for you is being gay about actually? And he in his answers there were many aspects, but one aspect that was that he said it's always about being different and have a different perspective on life and, you know, whatever circumstance. And I thought that was interesting. What would you say is it for you?
Well, in 1970, I wrote an article called "The Gay Philosopher," and I mean, which was a play on Nietzsche's title, but also the idea that gay people aren't raised to be gay, and they discover they're gay at age 16 or 60, and then they have to reinvent themselves completely. All their values, their expectations, everything is different, I think. And so I think what your friend said was true, that you do think of yourself very differently, and you're very reflective about yourself, about your experience.
Times are changing and biographies are changing. Why should gays want to be different? As long as the state, the church, and so on say you are sick, you are a sinner, you are I don't know what, then you have to object and build a political meaning to that. But if that does not exist anymore, why shouldn't gays be normal?
Well, you know, being normal is boring.
Maybe
it's also
most of us are boring.
Well, but then we should have. Well, then we would have to ask what is normal, you know,
Well,
especially in Berlin.
I just wrote a long article for the New York Review of Books about gay marriage, and I said in my own case it was not so appealing, but that it would be frivolous to object to gay marriage for the millions and millions of people who want to leave their property to their mate, who want to have their mate have visiting rights in hospitals, who want to give some stability to their children. Or let's say one of the gay partners dies, he wants to make sure the other one can become the new father or mother. of the child and not have the children be taken away. In other words, there are lots of serious societal issues, and if we, as aestheticized urban gays, think it's boring, who cares what we think, you know? I mean, that's very beside the point.
And maybe we are envious about the kids who don't have these problems we had.
Goodness. I think it's difficult, sort of difficult for me to follow you now with this thesis. I think it is very important to, at least, to carry into the present and into the future some aspects of what I would call a gay spiritual, emotional, and also lived heritage. And part of that heritage is part of the stigmatization. I think the stigmatization is, as also with people of the Jewish faith, something that teaches us a lot about life and society. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't want to miss it, but it's a fact that people, you know, discriminate and stigmatize one another, and it's a human condition. Unfortunately, it is, but it is, and so I think, you know, we should be aware of it, and I hope that, so to speak, there will always be gay and lesbian people, because by being different, they contribute to life and to what life is about, and life, I think, is about being different.
And that's why this museum is so great.
Right.
Yeah, because it preserves that heritage, including an image of the discrimination against gays in the past.
I agree.
Your interviews mostly about history. I noticed. Yes, your biographical talks. Very often you have an index in the back, and one of the names in the index, the most numbers of pages is Hitler. So there must be some historical interest. And I think that's why you ask the question in this way, because you always had a very, very distinct historical interest in the biographies. Otherwise, a biography wouldn't interest you if there wouldn't be something behind it, something historical. Am I right?
Well, that's true. Although I must say, it is the index that you're mentioning is bringing up what the people in my conversations have brought up. It's summarizing it. So it's not me who has made Hitler as a continuing subject through
and who
my conversations.
choose your partners?
Well, yes, myself, certainly. But, you know, a great extent of the topics and a great extent of the people who I have conversed with are older or elderly people. And it's natural that if they have gone through a great part of the 20th century, that, you know, Hitler, as unfortunately one of the most prominent or, you know, known people of the 20th century would be brought up, you know, whether these people I talked to were gay or communist or Jewish or, you know, aristocratic, in any sphere of life between 1900 and, you know, 1980, which is the span of time in which the people I have talked to were born, Hitler is, you know, unavoidable to talk about.
I always say Hitler drew out the heart of the Germans, and they don't dare to stand for their feelings, many of them.
Oh, that's interesting.
But, you know, the interesting thing is also that the National Socialists were responsible for, you know, chasing and also murdering the Jewish Germans, and by doing so erased to a large extent what shaped German culture or German refined culture. But they didn't manage ultimately to erase and chase out the gay people. And I think it is thanks to gay people that there is some cultivation, also some cultured life in Germany left. It is also thanks to gay people.
Why I brought up this question is, of course, everybody wants to be normal. When I realized that I'm gay at the age of, that I'm really gay, and it will not change at the age of 16 or so, I was I had the feeling it's normal. And I wanted to be normal, and I wanted to have a normal life. And I did not understand why anybody was against that. And so I can understand that somebody says, no, I don't want to be political. I just want to live a normal life with a husband and with children, and not be a political person. And I think
That's
it
funny.
was
I never had that longing, you know, to live a
We are
normal...
different people.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. How about you, Edmund?
Well, I remember...
Because you are, amongst the three of us, are the one who is finally married.
I am married.
And you once said, you know, you would never imagine you would.
I got married for very practical reasons, because my school where I teach will only give health insurance if you're married. And now that gays can get married, they must get married. So the system has made us all bourgeois.
Corrupted.
I mean, I grew up amongst painters, and they were all bohemian. And also, when I was young, the only straight people who liked gays were bohemians. And so I absorbed their values, and they didn't want to get married to each other. I mean, they hated marriage as a bad institution. And so I never wanted to get married either.
In your wonderful book, States of Desire, in the epilogue you say you even had socialist feelings at that time, and I think that's completely natural.
I mean, later I discovered that Soviet-style communism wasn't very friendly to gay people.
But on the other hand, I think, Edmund, you always try to, you have never been a very political person, or you kept it for yourself, as opposed to Bernd.
Well, I've been active in a few political things. Like I was the first president of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was the first AIDS organization, and I was one of the 6 founders of it. But then it's true that I fled that and I moved to Paris. And once I was in Paris, though AIDS caught up, I kept thinking that Paris would be like an AIDS holiday, but it wasn't, and it caught up with me. And then after Foucault died, his partner, Daniel Defer, created AID, AIDS, which was the French equivalent of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, or the Terence Higgins Trust. And I participated in their early meetings. But it's true that I always wanted to be a writer, and I tried to keep a certain degree of independence from politics. Because I think politics is a way of lying, and I think writing literature is a way of telling the truth.
You are a poetus doctus, a scholar, a very well-educated man. I learned in States of Desires that your roots are in Texas, in cowboy situations. Could you tell us a little more about the cowboy in you?
Well, both of my parents are Texans, and their grandparents were homesteaders. That is, when Texas opened as a territory, if all the people rushed in, and each one would get 100 acres, but you could only keep it if at the end of 5 years you had a house above ground. It couldn't be a mud house, or sod house they called them, and you had to have a fence around it. If you did those 2 things, you could keep the land, and my relatives managed to do that. And And then my grandfather became a professor because he said he didn't want a job in the sun. He wanted a job out of the sun, so that's why he became a professor. And although he was a rather unpleasant man, and his brother, who stayed a farmer and a cowboy, was much happier and wrote an autobiography called Happy All the Time. And so I don't know. My father was a cowboy when he was young, and then he became an engineer and moved up north.
And you told me that your mother was a psychoanalyst.
No, psychologist. Just
Psychologist.
She worked mainly with retarded and brain-damaged children. And she was sort of a pioneer in that. And by the way, she came oftentimes to Vienna and to Munich to work with doctors over here.
Very progressive. In the 40s,
50s,
50s?
50s, yeah.
Wow. And, you know, I always found it striking and also irritating, but at the same time fascinating that as a young boy, you dreamt that you would seduce your father. This is very unusual, I think, for a writer to admit that. Why was your father so fascinating?
Well, my parents got divorced when I was 7.
Yes.
And my father seemed quite mysterious to me. I lived with my mother. But in the dynamics of the family, my father controlled all the money, and he was the powerful one. And the idea was, the myth of the family was that my father had left my mother for my stepmother because she was more sexually appealing. Then I found out my father had sex with my sister, so then I thought, why not me? I don't know, it was a family that was completely awash in incest.
Again, a very good point. Thank you very much. Couldn't have been a better end for our for our talk, talking about biographies and the hidden items in it and the public items in it. Thank you very much.